Today is March 10th, 2019, in the city of East Hampton, Massachusetts, in the community room of my apartment complex at College Highway Apartments. And this is part two of a two-part video series called Racism and Race Aboard Ocean Liners. Now, in my first video, I tried to clear up this misconception that Cunard and White Star Line segregated people based upon race, color, or creed, or nationality. After doing some further research and reading articles, and also I'm beginning to read this new book, I'm going to say this again. There is no conclusive evidence that Cunard and White Star Line segregated people based upon race, color, or creed. However, there appears to be evidence that when black people who were free from slavery, upper middle class black people, and northern black abolitionists, when they tried to travel from the United States to Europe, they were blockaded from doing so by Cunard agents and American agents who worked for these steamship companies, because white middle class and upper middle class Americans from the North and the South who were very hostile and extremely racist toward people of color in a time period where people of color were considered to be slaves and property, would object to any person of color traveling so close to them in confined quarters on steamships. The thing that we have to understand is that this segregation of passengers was on a case-by-case basis, and it happened very frequently. But this was not something that was on an institutional level by British law. British law did not have segregation or racist segregation policies on its books. The reason why these British steamship companies frequently segregated passengers that were black or people of color, and this segregation ranged from completely segregating people from saloon and steerage passengers to basically having them confined to their cabin, or making it so they didn't interact with other passengers. This was done by the British steamship companies to appease white Americans. This does not mean that the British steamship companies agreed with the peculiar institution of racial segregation. But when it came down to it, when it came down to a decision between standing up for moral British principles or your economic interest, the economic interest usually won out over standing up for your British principles. Your British principles of fair play, liberty, and equal justice. And a lot of the reasons why British steamship companies made this decision, such as Samuel Cunard and Isabel Brunel, was because these steamship companies had very strong relationships with white Americans. They had contracts with them, they had deals with them, they had agreements, and the economic interest was more important than standing up for British principles, even if they didn't agree with how black people were treated, even if they participated in the mistreatment of black passengers aboard their ocean liners. The dollar spoke highly. And also I want to point out too that lots of people of color didn't fight segregation on ocean liners because they saw it as a bridge between leaving the racist slave-holding states of America and going towards the free, more open society of the British monarchy and European society. So it wasn't as important to the end game for black abolitionists and their quest to get over to Europe to get their message across. That does not mean that it was right. It does not mean that it was something that was moral, but it was something that happened. And the reason why I'm making this video is because I want to clear up these misconceptions that people have about transatlantic ocean liners. Yes, individual people of color were segregated on ocean liners, but it was not an institutional, systematic thing. As a matter of fact, there were several occasions where, despite the fact that these passengers began their crossing in segregated quarters, they ended up being able to be first-class passengers because of the efforts of the captain, because of the efforts of the second mate, because of the efforts of individual first-class passengers who were appalled at their treatment. Now, I also want to point out, too, that there's this shared bond. It's called the special relationship, but I'm going to extend it further, right? We have this special relationship between the United States and Great Britain because we share certain values, we share certain customs, we share certain traditions. But I think when we think about the special relationship between the 1830s and the 1890s, or even into the early 20th century, this is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant shared relationship, right? In the sense that even though British people are not as racist as Americans, right? Slavery is a thing that you can talk about in the colonies. It's not something that happened in the UK, right? British white people didn't benefit from slavery the same way that the white Americans benefit from slavery. In the sense that slavery in the UK was conducted and done by corporations and not by ordinary common white folk in the British Isles, as opposed to in the United States. But there's this shared bond in the white Anglo-Saxon world of superiority. So it explains, in my mind, it explains to me why black people were segregated on British ocean liners. Even though British people said they had nothing against people of color, per se, there was this shared bond of superiority over the Negro races, right? And even though British people thought of what was happening to black people was morally and legally wrong, that did not mean that they thought of Negroes, as they were called back then, as socially and intellectually equal to whites in our society. So a lot of the frequent case-by-case segregation, I think, was motivated by this shared bond in the white Anglo-Saxon world. And this is why it was so easy for the British steamship companies to segregate people when a upper middle class white person threatened to boycott their business or threatened to tell their friends about this. Because even though they thought it was wrong, they weren't going to take an economic risk for an inferior race of people. And that's the truth. Now, we know that Samuel Kennard said that segregation would not happen on his ocean liners again. Unfortunately, that was an empty promise because it continued, unfortunately. But I also want to point out, too, that lots of black people who were able to afford to travel felt it as a very freeing experience, because this was the first time that they were going to be heading towards a place where they were going to be able to walk around freely and openly. I think in the Western world, out of all the Western countries in the world, when we talk about the Western world, we refer to the United States, Canada, Australia, Great Britain, etc. I think America and South Africa are the two most oppressive, policing countries when it comes to racism against people of color. And it makes perfect sense to me that these two countries, as today as they were back then, are still policing people of color in every shape, sound, and movement. of people of color. I'm sorry if I'm stuttering. I'm talking off the cuff here, off the top of my head. But when you think about white Americans and their insistence upon segregation and their insistence upon controlling people of color, even on British steamships, ships that they did not own, it proves to me that people of color have constantly, in the United States, been policed, surveilled, and monitored in a way that they have not been ever in British society. And this is why lots of abolitionists and people of color took the crossing and endured the terrible crosses of the North Atlantic before the grand ocean liners of the Lusitania, Mauretania, and Aquitania, because they were heading towards a place where they weren't going to be constantly policed and constantly surveilled, where they weren't going to be constantly be called a nigger every time they walked down the street. It wasn't something that was always an everyday thing. There was widespread racism and prejudice in Europe and in the British Isles, but it wasn't as potent and violent as it was in the United States. And getting back to coming around full circle to the fact that there was segregation on ocean liners, I want people to remember that this segregation was not something that was imposed by British law or by British regulations. This was a form of segregation that was imposed and forced upon British steamship companies and British ships by upper middle class white Americans from the North and the South, who were accustomed to segregation and slavery and the subjugation of black people in the United States. Now, that does not mean that Great Britain is absolved of its responsibility. I think it was sort of cowardice for the British steamship companies not to stand up to Americans and say, you're not going to tell us what to do on British steamships. It happened from time to time, but it wasn't something that as prevalent as I thought it was. Now, when we go up to Titanic time, to Joseph LaRoche, right? It makes sense that Joseph LaRoche would be a second-class passenger now, because it was extremely difficult. I mean, if you could get past the racist agents and you could get past the racist white Americans in America, the eastbound crossing appears to be extremely difficult. But the westbound crossing was a breeze compared to the eastbound crossing. And that's because Europe and the British Isles did not have a custom or a system of segregation in the same way that America did. And that's the truth. I hope this video clears up a lot of things. I never actually got a chance to talk about Victor Giulio, but Victor Giulio was in fact a mixed person. He was half Egyptian and half English. It makes sense to me that he would be categorized as Italian because of the fact that a lot of Italians, a lot of Sicilian Italians were just as dark as he was, especially during the summer when they got tanned. So it makes sense to me that James Cameron would have gotten that wrong, because it was assumed that he was just simply Italian. He was Italian. I think he was Italian, Egyptian, and English. He was a mixed person, and I didn't get a chance to clear that up in my last video. So I hope this video clears up a lot of things from the first video. I'm going to listen to this video and see if it makes sense. If not, I'll make a third video. But this is my part 2 of a 2-part series, apparently, because I had to go back and change some information that I learned. But that's it for now. Stay tuned for more videos.